The Unsettled Peace of '60. Introduction to the deeply divided nation just before the war. The year 1860 dawned not with the promise of unity, but with the cold, hard certainty of a nation tearing itself apart. The peace was less a state of tranquility and more a brittle, frozen surface stretched over a molten core of irreconcilable differences. Everywhere, from the bustling docks of Boston to the sun-baked cotton fields of Georgia, people spoke of division, not as a hypothetical threat, but as an impending, inevitable doom. In the North, the abolitionist fervor had reached a shrieking pitch. Ministers in New England pulpits thundered against the peculiar institution of slavery, painting it not merely as an economic system, but as a moral stain on the American soul. The recent memory of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a fresh wound. To Northerners, Brown was a martyr. To Southerners, he was the horrifying embodiment of Northern aggression, a terrorist whose actions justified their deepest fears about the safety of their way of life. South of the Mason-Dixon line, the mood was one of fierce, defiant defense. The planter class, whose immense wealth and societal structure rested entirely upon the labor of nearly 4 million enslaved people, viewed any federal interference as an unforgivable violation of states' rights and private property. They saw the North not as fellow Americans, but as a foreign industrial power attempting to colonize and destroy their civilization. They argued the very foundation of the Republic, the right to self-government, was under threat. The political arena had failed. The Democratic Party fractured into Northern and Southern factions that could no longer agree on a single candidate or platform. The upstart Republican Party, led by the gaunt, self-taught politician Abraham Lincoln, ran on a platform that explicitly opposed the extension of slavery into the new Western territories. Though Lincoln promised not to disturb slavery where it already existed, the South saw his very election as the final, fatal blow. November 1860 delivered the verdict. Lincoln won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. The result was not accepted. It was treated as a declaration of war. In South Carolina, bonfires were lit not in celebration, but in grim anticipation. Secession was not whispered, it was loudly proclaimed. The peace was officially unsettled, replaced by a tense waiting game. The last few weeks of the year were a study in cognitive dissonance. Americans brought Christmas trees and baked pies while reading newspaper headlines that detailed the dismantling of the Union. Fathers quietly sharpened old hunting knives. Sons volunteered for militias. The thin veneer of peace was dissolving like cheap paint. By the time the calendar turned to 1861, the divided nation had ceased to function as one. The question was no longer if the Union would dissolve, but when, and with how much blood. This introduction successfully establishes the political climate, the key moral and economic divides, and the tense atmosphere of 1860, concluding at the point of imminent conflict. The fire in Charleston Harbor, the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and the formal beginning of the conflict. The quiet, tense waiting that had defined the winter of 1861 shattered irrevocably on a Friday morning in April. Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, a picturesque crescent of sea and sand that had been the cradle of secession, suddenly became the epicenter of the American tragedy. For months, Major Robert Anderson, commanding a small, isolated Union garrison, had defiantly occupied Fort Sumter, a federal outpost built on a man-made island in the harbor. He was a symbol to the north, a provocation to the south. Surrounding him, the newly formed Confederate States of America had fortified every vantage point, loading cannons at Fort Moultrie and Battery Wagner. The air was thick with gunpowder and politics. The crisis came to a head when Anderson, desperately low on supplies, refused a final ultimatum to surrender. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, the stillness was ripped apart by a mortar shell fired from the Confederate-held Fort Johnson. The shell arced high over the dark water, exploding with a deafening crack directly over Fort Sumter. It was not merely a shot fired, it was the declaration of civil war. The initial hours were surreal. The Confederates unleashed a punishing, relentless barrage. Cannonballs rained down on the brick fortress, tearing away chunks of masonry and sending geysers of spray into the air. The heavy, booming percussion was felt for miles. Yet inside the fort, Major Anderson's small force, only 85 men, could offer little reply. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and surrounded by their own countrymen. The bombardment lasted for 34 straight hours. Day broke, revealing the damage. The fort's wooden barracks were set ablaze, sending clouds of thick, choking black smoke billowing skyward. The Union soldiers struggled not just against the Confederate ordnance, but against the fire itself, trying frantically to save their gunpowder reserves from the flames. The very flag, which had flown proudly since the evacuation of Fort Moultrie, was shot down, only to be quickly re-raised by a courageous soldier. Finally, on the afternoon of April 13th, with his men exhausted and the fort practically reduced to rubble, Anderson knew the fight was futile. He agreed to terms. The evacuation of the Union troops on April 14th was strangely peaceful. They marched out with full honors, carrying their tattered flag. But the spectacle was deceiving. No one had been killed in the actual bombardment, though one Union soldier would die later in a cannon salute mishap. Yet the symbolic violence was absolute. The fire in Charleston Harbor had ignited a conflict that would claim over 620,000 lives and redefine the American Republic forever. The peace was not just unsettled, it was gone. This segment provides a chronological, impactful account of the event, focusing on the immediate action and the profound symbolism of the attack. Brother against brother, choosing the banner. The personal and moral decision to join the Union or Confederate forces. The smoke had barely cleared from Fort Sumter before President Lincoln's proclamation landed like a stone across the nation. He called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This was the moment of truth. The war was no longer an abstract political argument. It was a demand for blood, loyalty, and an impossible choice. In the border states, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, the decision was a waking nightmare. Here, families were truly divided. It was not uncommon for a father to side with the Union and his eldest son to ride south with the Confederacy. Take the case of the Fairchild brothers from a quiet farm in western Virginia. Elijah, the elder, had spent a year working in a Cincinnati factory. He had witnessed the burgeoning abolitionist movement and, more importantly, had begun to believe fiercely in the integrity of the Union. To him, the secessionists were traitors who had willfully torn apart the greatest experiment in human government. "It is not about the Negro, Caleb," Elijah argued one tense evening, the glow of the kerosene lamp reflecting in their anxious eyes. "It is about the Constitution. If we allow any state to walk away whenever it disagrees with an election, then what is America?
nothing but shifting sand. Caleb, only 19, saw the matter through a different lens, the lens of home and hearth. Their small farm lay closer to Richmond than to Washington. His loyalty was fiercely local. "They will march on us, Elijah. The Yankees will come down here and tell us how to live and who we must obey," Caleb retorted, his voice tight with defensive pride. "The state of Virginia has left the Union. Our allegiance is to Virginia. It's about defending the soil our grandparents bled for, not some abstract law written in Philadelphia." For Caleb, the war was a fight for self-determination and against northern invasion. For Elijah, it was a fight for the preservation of the nation. The next morning, the silence at the breakfast table was heavier than any
spoken word. Caleb packed his saddlebags, taking the family's old hunting rifle. He kissed his mother goodbye, a silent, heartbroken pledge. He rode east, joining a local cavalry company under the stars and bars. Elijah stood on the porch, watching his brother disappear down the dusty road. He knew that if he stayed, he would effectively be siding with the Confederates through inaction. That evening, he walked to the nearest town still loyal to the federal government and signed the enlistment papers. He traded his worn farm clothes for the blue uniform. The line had been drawn, not by political maps, but by the agonizing split in the Fairchild family's very soul. The war was now personal, driven by two men fighting for two incompatible versions of what America ought to be. This segment introduces two contrasting characters whose paths illustrate the subtitle perfectly, setting the stage for their divergent journeys through the war. The Oath and the Training Grounds. Military training, the early idealism, and the first exposure to war's reality. Elijah Fairchild stood on a dusty field outside a makeshift camp in Ohio, his right hand raised, swearing the oath of allegiance. The words, "I will support the Constitution of the United States and bear true allegiance to the same," felt heavy and righteous, a direct counter to the choice his brother, Caleb, had made. Around him, hundreds of other young men, mostly farmers and shop clerks from the Midwest, echoed the pledge. They were the army of the Union, and in their minds, they were saviors of the Republic. The air was thick with early idealism. They were going to put down the rebellion in 90 days and return home heroes. Reality, however, arrived the moment the oath ended. Their camp, a sprawl of canvas tents pitched haphazardly in a former pasture, was a muddy, chaotic mess. The romance of the uniform, the distinctive blue coat, was instantly replaced by the scratchy wool, poorly fitted boots, and the relentless, back-breaking monotony of military training. Their drill sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Hayes, who had fought in the Mexican-American War, wasted no time in shattering their romantic visions. "You men ain't soldiers," Hayes roared, spitting tobacco juice onto the grass. "You got a soft, confused lumps of farm-fed beef. I gotta turn you into killing machines before the rebels do it for me." Days began before dawn with the shrill blast of the bugle. The men learned to stand in formation for hours, their muscles cramping under the weight of their new Springfield rifles. They practiced the awkward, precise movements of manual of arms, shoulder arms, fixed bayonets, order arms. The rifle was their life, and the repeated drills were mind-numbing, intended to burn the movements into muscle memory so that fear wouldn't freeze them in battle. But the training ground offered more than just drills. It was their first exposure to war's reality, albeit a grim, indirect one. Sickness swept through the poorly sanitized camp with merciless speed. Typhoid and dysentery, the camp diseases, killed more men in the first few months than Confederate bullets would. Elijah watched a young man from Indiana, barely 18, die in the cot next to him, his body racked by fever. There was no glory in that death, only the stench of illness and the terrifying realization that the enemy was not just the man in gray, but the invisible scourge of unsanitary conditions.
The idealism began to flake away, replaced by a grim, shared toughness. Elijah's initial fervor curdled into a disciplined, weary resolve. He no longer dreamed of triumphant parades. He dreamed only of executing his drill flawlessly and surviving the night. The oath had made him a soldier, but the training grounds were forging him into a hardened instrument of war. This was today's story from history. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next episode with another fascinating tale from the past. Until then, stay curious.